Well, good evening. Welcome again. I said I didn't have far to come. I think my house is 7 minutes from here. So it's nice to be in the neighborhood, and it's nice to be at Pine Street Baptist, and it's nice to meet you all. And I would like to meet you and to find out who you are. We're an intimate enough group tonight that we have time to do that. Forrest Gump's mother was right. Like, life is like a box of chocolates, right? You never know what you're going to get. Same thing's true when you invite somebody in from the outside to talk to you about your church. You don't know me and I don't know you well, but I appreciate the opportunity to share with you, which is exactly what I have come to do tonight. I have not come as an expert, not come with any answers. I don't come with any prescribed notion about your direction, or the work that you've done so far is excellent. And I'm here to be a thought person with you, and to think with you, and to dream with you a bit, and to find out more about what's going on at Pine Street Baptist Church. I'm a native Texan. I was born in Tyler, Texas, raised in Dallas. My dad later moved us to Oklahoma. I'm a product of Oklahoma Baptist University, Southwestern Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas, and then TCU, Texas Christian, is where I did my doctoral work. I moved East Coast in 1985 to the Clemson, South Carolina area, and pastored in Dallas for 7 years, and then to Clemson, and then down to Tampa, Florida for 13 years, where we raised our only son. We were there for 13 years, and Tampa, Florida was home for us. Then to Northern Virginia, to that crazy place up there for 8 years, and then to Richmond, where I worked with the Virginia Baptist Mission Board for a couple of 2 or 3 years, and then began working with the Center for Healthy Churches. 4 years ago, I lost my wife of 46 years, which was, maybe some of you have been in that spot, but the worst experience of my life. And I kind of disappeared for a couple of years, and I figured in the first 18 months I left home 37 times, packed my bags and left. And people said, well, you must be running from your grief. And I said, exactly, that's exactly what I'm doing. If you've ever been in that process, you know that's a pretty life altering experience. Ann and I met at Oklahoma Baptist and married. We struggled to have children, and they said we never would, but we have one son, Graham, who was born in Dallas. Graham is married to Amanda. I have 3 grandkids, and they live in the East Village in New York City. And so I'm in New York City a lot, and that's another crazy place, but that's where home is for them, so I'm there a lot. 50 years ago at Oklahoma Baptist University as a freshman, I met a woman by the name of Dana Rose. Dan and I were freshmen together. She met and married her husband, and moved and established her life primarily over in Radford, Virginia, where she was a professor. Through a lot of different life circumstances, we both ended up in Richmond, Virginia, and kind of found each other as friends. We have a lot of common friends around the country, and one thing led to another. And a year ago, May, we got married in New York City. Dana has 3 sons. They're all married, and she has a whole bunch of grandkids, and we have more coming. And so she's in New York City a lot, so that worked out really well for us to be able to have all of our family in New York City. So you can imagine about every 4 to 6 weeks, there's some reason why we need to be in New York. So I've enjoyed my life in this work that I do with the Center for Healthy Churches. There's probably 20 of us, Philip, that are underneath this umbrella of the Center for Healthy Churches. We're all kind of independent folks, but we coalesce together and kind of unite together to do common work. Bill Wilson, who was the president of Virginia Baptist Association for some years, was over at Waynesboro. Pastor First Baptist Waynesboro is our president. And over the course of about the last 7 or 8 years, we have worked with well over 100 churches all over the United States, all different kinds of churches, churches that are of different sizes, of different slants in terms of how they do things, different denominations even. And we work with transitions, that is churches that get without pastors and they're looking for ministers. We work with churches that are in conflict. Can you imagine a Baptist church or a church in conflict? We do conflict work, conflict resolution. We do visioning and mission work, helping congregations kind of come to a clear sense about who they are and where they want to go, and all kinds of other things as well. We do board development, we do deacon development, other kinds of specialties. So I've really enjoyed it. None of us do this because we have to, meaning we're not full-time at this. We do it because at this stage in life that we find ourselves, it's a way to turn and to say, how can we help? How can we continue to invest our experience and what we have been able to learn and to share? How do we turn that and work with congregations? So that's the work. And I'm not nearly as busy as I used to be. I'm supposedly, according to my family, you should be relaxing, but I don't seem to be able to do that very well. So I'm continuing to do this kind of work. So, and Dan and I live on Grove Avenue in the Fan. Dana's father, Mr. Rose, was really active with the Cary Street Mission, Baptist Mission, back in the day. I don't know if you would have known their family. They were at Hatcher Memorial, and then they were at First Baptist Richmond. And Dana and her 3 sisters, the 4 of them, were the Rose sisters, and they used to sing all over town. And so her experience and my experience are very similar in terms of our backgrounds. So life is new and different, and there's a whole lot of change for me, right? I mean, this is a trajectory I would never have taken, or would never have thought I would have taken. But you move forward, and you make changes and make adjustments, and guess what? You find out that God is in the midst of all things. And so that's been a great learning experience for me, and I think it translates pretty well to congregations as well. You go through different phases, you go through different adjustments and change and so forth. And so it's a really good teaching experience for me. So that's enough about me. They always say that when you stand up in front of a group of new people, that half the people want to know more about you and the other half just want you to shut up about yourself and do what you came to do. So I hope I've hit a middle ground this evening. So tell me about yourselves. Tell me who you are. And maybe just tell me your name and how long you've been at Pine Street and what you're involved in. That would be helpful. We'll just start over here.
My name is Meredith Carrington. My family and my church family call me Merritt. Like Merit badge, not like the cigarettes. I have been here since, I don't know, 2-ish, like 2 years old, so 40 plus years now. Yeah, and so I was raised in this church, and I'm raising our family at this church.
Great. Thank you. Yes.
And I get to be Merritt's mom. My name is Susan Townsend, and I am a retired nurse, as of 2 years, and kind of wear lots of different hats here.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Sunday school teacher, heading up some mission work, deacon, director. Oh, and
Director.
that's enough.
Thanks, Susan.
Chairperson of the Mission Committee.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's more than you know.
Yeah.
It's a long list.
And Meredith, she's a deacon, and she's our public relations person, and there's probably some other things.
Great.
Well.
She's our moderator.
Our moderator.
When did you come? I guess when I was 4 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, we moved into this neighborhood, and was raised Catholic, so went to Catholic church across the bridge, but was just kind of drawn. There's a lot of activities for children here. My husband, Baptist, and so I just kind of jumped ship.
Great.
But once a Catholic, always kind of, there's a little something there.
Yeah, I can appreciate
It
that.
never goes away.
Thank you.
And I'm Jennifer, and I've been here at Pine Street for 31 years and was on the staff for the first 5 of those as Minister of Outreach, and then became the director of the former Cary Street Center, which is now the Oregon Hill Baptist Center. And we've raised our 2 girls here, and lived here in the neighborhood for 26 years, I think. Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Appreciate it. Back
I'm
here.
Linda, and I'm kind of a newbie. I wasn't raised in this church. I'm the music director in Livingston. I will have been here 50 years in November.
Oh, wow. Wow.
I was a baby.
Yeah.
2.
I was 8 when she came.
Yeah.
I always tell her that.
He likes to point that out. And I raised my 2 sons here, and now I have 2 grandsons that come here with me
Great.
regularly. And so seen a lot of changes.
I'm
a lot
sure.
of things, and but ready for us to move in a really positive direction.
Thanks, Linda. Appreciate it.
And I am Gwen Donahue. I have been here for 92 years. I was raised, my family has come through.
Wow.
All ahead of me have been active in this church in various different.
I'm sure.
And
Yeah.
Gwen, as we've talked, Gwen was very influential in starting an endowment program years
Yeah,
ago.
great.
And as we've talked, that's really what keeps us moving
Yeah.
today financially.
Yeah,
Mhm.
sure. Yeah. It's nice to meet you, Gwen. 92 years. That's great.
Hi, I'm Terry. That's my mom. I can usually claim her on Thursday, so. I have been here 66 years. Cradle roll is common amongst their people. We didn't used to lose too many as when you went through the years, because there was a strong family connection that just generation after
Sure.
generation after generation. That's changed over the last little bit, but that was a core of Pine Street history for a while. I work with children, I work with missions, and I'm currently serving as a deacon.
Great, thanks.
I'm Jessica. When did I start coming here? I was been sitting here like
2008.
2008. I was gonna say 2007 or
Maybe
2008.
first coming as a visitor,
That's right.
like in 2002, 2003.
So I came through Merritt. I went to college with Merritt, and she invited me to come, and I've been
I
here
never knew
ever
that.
since.
Great.
We lived across the hall from each other.
Yeah. Since freshman
Which
year.
college?
Mary Baldwin.
Mary Baldwin. Great. Great.
I'm personnel and other things, I think. I can't ever keep it straight, but wherever I'm needed. And raising my 2 kids, and my husband comes, and we're invested in seeing Pine Street in the next phase of whatever that may be.
That's great. Thanks. Well, thank you all very much. I
And
appreciate you being
And I'll
here.
just tell you so you'll know, just for those who aren't here, Jessie, who's not here, she's a physical therapist. Her and her husband come. They're in there getting close to 40 or hit 40. Young adult in our church now is 40. They're not here. Jennifer Downer and her husband come, and children, and she's in her 40s, right? Joe, who's on the committee, Joe's 80.
Ish.
Former police officer, been here his whole life.
Retired Richmond police officer.
One of our few males. Most of our leadership is all female. And most of the church is all female. Highest percentage. And then Betty, who is in her 80s, is not here. Marguerite, who is in her late 80s, is not here. Her daughter Gail, you'll find a lot of that. Gail's, Gail's in her 60s, late 60s. She retired now, close to 70. And then Lindsay Hirschner and her husband, who are not here. She works for, she's a social worker, and they both just adopted 2 children in the past couple of years. And then Clint, our associate's been here. What did we just celebrate? 15 years. 15 years, but he's not here tonight. So that's just kind of give you a feel for who's missing and their ages and so forth.
Great. So you all worked for a while before COVID, right? You were working on some stuff.
We had one.
Just had started.
We had one congregational meeting lunch afterwards in January.
Okay.
And then we were going to start the process, and then
Okay, so you never moved through the Lewis Center process.
we did.
You did
We did
move through.
afterwards.
After that.
We started that a year ago, maybe. We started meeting together again and had some meetings and some videos that we watched.
Okay, so
and
you
those
did move
kind of-
through
and
that
we-
process.
And their exercises and so forth, and just
Yeah.
kind of adapted it to us.
Okay. Why do you think I'm here tonight? What is y'all sense about that? You can just pop.
I think it's just what Philip said. I think everybody feels like you need an outside person that doesn't know all the personalities or all the things and can look at it very,
Some objective
yeah,
point
very
of view.
objectively, yes.
Okay. When you think about kind of where your church is headed, right? Is that what you're saying? You want to think about the future and what does the future hold for you all? Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, good. I'm going to move pretty fast through just a handful of slides. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we do as the Center for Healthy Churches. Although tonight I'm not here to make a big formal presentation about all the things that we do. I will share with you just really simply kind of what our core is about how we work and what we do. But I came here mainly tonight to listen to you and to start a dialogue with you. And as I said in the beginning, it used to be that there were church consultants, the Alban Institute or the Virginia Baptist or Southern Baptist. Everybody had consultants. And consultants would come and they would look at all the numbers or they would look at all the space and they would make recommendations, right? They would present a white paper or present several papers on this is what you ought to do based upon, some prescribed knowledge about what would make a church successful. But a long time ago, many of us said that there's really no one size that fits all when it comes to congregations. And every congregation is unique. Every congregation has its own special DNA, its own sense about its values, what's important to it. And every situation, demographically or any number of ways you want to slice it, but every congregation has different influences that affect it. And so the whole idea that somebody could come in from the outside and have some specialty, and then they would say to a congregation, this is what you ought to do, that's pretty presumptuous. And, I wouldn't want somebody doing that to me in my own personal life. And so I just want you to know that that's not the purpose of my being here tonight. We believe in process, and that is to say that you really gain the most effect when you honor a process and move through that process, listening process and dreaming process and developing and understanding, what you do need to know about your community. and then to do some work in terms of what does the future look like because of that kind of work. And those three categories are basically past, present, future, or basically how we work with congregational meetings and so forth. And we listen and we take notes, and you all, if you all are a leadership team, you all would be doing the work, so to speak, because the only work that really sticks is the work that you do. The work that doesn't stick is a report that goes on a shelf somewhere, and it gets dusty and nobody ever pays any attention to it. So it's a process, and that's basically that's the conversation that I'm starting with you all tonight. You can see, you can read as well as I can speak, but this is our mission statement, that we are devoted to improving the spiritual, emotional, and organizational health of churches. We bring hope, help, and healing in the name of Christ. And that is really simple. That's a really simple statement about what it is that we do. This is our theological underpinning, so to speak. This is our way of doing this work with congregations. The first time that I heard the phrase, the spirit of holy indifference, it sounded like the definition that we normally think of as indifference. Indifferent people are people that don't care and they're backed out and they're not engaged. But this is something very different. Saint Ignatius, one of the old fathers of the church, out of the church before there was the Protestant church, did some work related to holy indifference. And what that means to us is that the only way a congregation gets to a place where it actually is in a position to be engaged to move forward to the future is if the congregation, through prayer and through a willing, submissive process, says, I have a lot of strong feelings about my church. I have a lot of strong feelings about how I think church ought to go. I have a lot of opinions, right? Who is short on opinions these days? But the way that we have seen God at work in the life of congregations is when a congregation will say, I am going to start the process of being indifferent and put on the back burner my sense about what I think ought to happen in the church, and begin to listen for what I assume God wants in a church. And that is not easy. I'm working with a congregation right now that's looking for a minister. I just finished working with First Baptist Wilmington, North Carolina, a wonderful church that just hired a very impressive young minister. When they started that process down in Wilmington, nobody in their right mind would have ever thought they would hire a pastor under 40 years of age, but they did. And when they started that process and the pastor search team first began to meet, the person that they finally settled on and felt as if God was leading them to did not fit initially what everybody thought was the quintessential profile for the pastor for First Baptist Wilmington. How did they get there? They did a really good job of saying, I've thought that this is what we need, but what I've come to realize is that God is leading us to this person who with these skills and with this ability and with this, in this station in life. And so this whole process, the Center for Healthy Churches, if we're working with a congregation, we ask this fundamental question. Is there anything that I need to set aside so that I can be open to what God wants? And what needs to die in me in order for God's will to come forth in my life? Now, that sounds pretty drastic, but it's really straight out of the heart of the cruciform gospel that we all say we're a part of, that things are born out of death, that life comes out of dying, that resurrection happens because something dies in the beginning. And the only way that real freedom comes into the life of a congregation is that if the people that are leading the congregation are willing to say, I submit myself to a higher sense of direction and calling. And I am willing personally to set aside my own sense about direction and listen for God's direction. And also, join with this, is that it's not just about me, but it starts with me, but it's also the congregation. Is the congregation willing to say, not my will, but God's will? So nothing more, nothing else, and nothing less than this. Does that make sense? It's a pretty big step, and it's not an easy step for a lot of congregations. I would say that the number one issue facing American congregations these days is that churches are not willing to start at this place. If you want to do some reading, go and look at the Hartford Church study that just the new 2020 study is out. That's the best analysis of congregational life in the United States. And I can send, Philip, if you don't have that immediately at your fingertips, I can send that to you for everybody. But you know, one of the things that Hartford said a few years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, is that any congregation that was established before 1980 is in decline, period. And they just made that blanket statement. And obviously, you know, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that Pine Street is part of that demographic, right? That Pine Street has been in decline for a long time in terms of numbers of people and people on hand, et cetera, et cetera. And that is true for 85 to 90% of the congregations in the United States right now. And you add to that COVID, and you've got a whole other dynamic that is at work that we still don't necessarily understand in terms of what is necessary. So those two things alone suggest that, you know, when you get to the place of saying you're going to sort of invest yourself and create a dynamism moving forward, you were saying that you were signing up for a very significant process. That this is not something you do casually. It's not something you can do and then carry on business as usual and assume that anything's going to change. It just does, it's not going to happen. So one of the reasons that I'm here tonight, when Philip talked to me about visioning and talking about moving forward in the future, is to basically get a sense from you all about whether or not you're really ready to do that. Because if you're not, you'll do a visioning process and it'll be, you know, maybe it'll be beautiful, I don't know. But it won't be worth anything to you if you're not at a place where you're ready to say, we want to invest at this level. And we are willing to say, we will relinquish our hold and we will allow the future to unfold as God leads us into that future. And with the best, you know, information we have, with the best relational skills that we have, with the best resources that we have, our human resources, we will submit those things to God into a process that will lead us who knows where. I have no idea where you need to end up tonight. I really don't. But I do know this, that the only way to be, the only way to move beyond where you are is to be willing to submit yourself to that process. I think it's true for individuals as well. So taking stock, you know, you all are at the place of looking, you know, in terms of making some big decisions about buildings and location, et cetera, et cetera. But every congregation in the United States, every 3 years or so, should take a hard look at their direction and at what they want to do, and ask, you know, what is God's will and direction for us in our lives. But then let's just talk about what's necessary coming out of COVID. Here's what every church must consider coming out of COVID. Renewal, because nobody's the same as they were 2.5 years ago. Revision, or resurrection. And resurrection means that a lot of things have died. I was telling Jennifer earlier, I'm the chairman of the board of the Norfolk Street Choir Project. It's a homeless project in Norfolk, Virginia, in the Hampton Roads area. A wonderful project. When I was helping Freemason Street Baptist Church in Norfolk to kind of reimagine what they were a part of, they recommitted to their neighborhood there in downtown Norfolk, and that's not an easy neighborhood. But one of the things that it kind of was presented to the church through the vision of the minister of music was, we've been thinking about this homeless choir idea. And people are like, what? I'll just tell you the short story. Within about 2 years, 50 voices were singing. They sang at my wife's funeral at First Baptist Church Richmond. PBS did a special that's won 2 Emmys, local Emmys. It just exploded. And we had 800 people on the church parking lot for a street requiem in 2017. Well, COVID hit and no choirs sang. We're singing, right? And people dispersed, and we lost our community to a great number. And what we've had to realize is that we're not the same choir that sang 2 years ago, and we can't expect the same people are not coming back. We can't expect that the choir just to reform. So we're in a revision and resurrection process with the Norfolk Street Choir Project. And primarily because of COVID, we were doing everything we hoped to do and more, but we really now have had to regroup. We pivoted and did an arts program. We had visual arts people come in from the university to lead, and we've done some wonderful things. But the choir hadn't been able to sing, so it's not the same as it was before all this happened. So I mention this because you happen to be in this process, and you happen to have this process in the pipeline. Before COVID began, but certainly after COVID, everybody's having to think about how they're going to do church. I'm not a member at First Baptist Richmond, but I'm very close to the minister at First Baptist Richmond. And because Jim Somerville shared on his Facebook page some recent numbers for First Baptist, I thought I would share those with you tonight if you haven't seen them. But when I moved to Richmond, First Baptist Church had 1,000 or so people in worship. They didn't maintain that, probably 4 or 5 years ago. They were showing fewer people, but still extremely strong, as you can well imagine. But Jim shared that after COVID, their average attendance has been about 300 to 350. Well, they were running 700 before COVID hit. They have 1,000 people that dial in and watch on their simulcast. And they have the TV ministry that some of you may see periodically, and that has another 10, 15,000, but that audience has been there for a while. But it just got my attention because I assumed that they were back and strong and at full capacity, and the truth is they're going to struggle to get back to those numbers, and they may never get back into that place. So Dr. Somerville is preaching a sermon series on how can the church reform after COVID? How are we going to understand the church? And basically going back to the beginning days of the early church and saying, what are the key factors, the Acts 2 factors for what congregations are really about? And I think that's a really effective thing to do. And it's part of what we do in our work as well. You all have seen this, right? I think that Philip said you've seen this bell curve. Bob Dale, who was one of our bright and shining stars at Virginia Baptist Work, wrote To Dream Again, a book that was part of my doctoral work. I don't know how many doctoral projects included this work, but I pastored a small church when I first started being the senior minister, and it was not in good shape when I started, and so I quickly began to read and to learn and to figure out kind of where I needed to go. And this bell curve probably helped me more than anything. And I'll just go through this quickly, but churches get launched, and that was a long time ago for Pine Street. And momentum and growth, and Philip told me at one time Pine Street had the largest Sunday school attendance of any church in the Southern Baptist Convention. I think Tabernacle also was way up there. Strategic growth, you plan, you develop, you build buildings like this. You begin to build a strong congregation. You have a period of sustained health, and people are happy, people are coming. There's no sense about church not being healthy. Then the church moves to maintenance. That is to say that it kind of loses its steam, so to speak, right? It loses its sort of all the energies and time and effort that goes into building something. It kind of wanes, and it's just kind of part of what happens. The next stage after maintenance is preservation. You know, you begin to hear a lot more stories about the past. You begin to see more attachment to a facility. You see decisions being made that are safe. You know, I mean, let's do the safe thing here. Let's not risk much, because if we risk much, we might fail, and if we fail, then what's that going to mean? And so you get into this preservation mode. And I keep wanting to use athletic images here, and I've learned recently that, you know, I've been schooled on the fact that you don't need to talk about athletics all the time, but you know, any team that ever decides to play it safe and to assume that they can, quote, sit on a lead, finds himself in real trouble, and churches do exactly the same thing. And then the final thing is life support. You've already said that the endowment is one of the reasons why you're able to operate. We would put that in life support. That without that help to breathe, so to speak, you would not be able to sustain a congregation based on your tithes and offerings just normally, or the staff that you have, or the facility that you have, and you all know this. That's, I think, why you've gotten to the place where you've gotten to at this particular point. I don't know exactly what you covered in terms of options that you have, but just kind of known practice out there among people that work with congregations all around the country, that once a church gets below 75 people in attendance, not in membership, but in attendance, that's when a church really needs to start thinking about, like you all are, what do we need to do? What do we need to do? So the first conversation that I had with Philip was really around relocation. I think it was like, well, we need to talk about, do we need to relocate and move neighborhoods? And that happens with churches that get down to a certain number, or that lose connection with their neighborhood, or the neighborhood changes. I was baptized at Cliff Temple Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, in Oak Cliff. We had 5,000 members. We had a bowling alley. We had gymnasium. We had roller skating. It was great. You know, I didn't mind going to church on Sunday night, because if you knew your scripture verse, you got a Hershey bar as a prize, and then you got to go down and roller skate. And I don't even remember that we had to go to worship on Sunday nights. They had it, but I guess we did, because I can't imagine my mother letting me miss. But it was pretty good. Well, Oak Cliff in Dallas has transitioned now at least 5 major times through ethnic groups. It transitioned first to African American community, white flight, people moved out. They never came back. They went to Duncanville, went to Richardson, Texas, you name it. It transitioned from a primarily African American neighborhood to a Hispanic neighborhood. It transitioned from Hispanic to Asian. It transferred from Asian to gentrification, with younger couples moving back into Oak Cliff because it's the most beautiful part of Dallas, and restoring these older homes. And my point being that my old church, Cliff Temple Baptist Church, took a huge hit through all of these transitions because it was primarily, almost exclusively, well, it was exclusively a white congregation of middle-class people. And when those people moved away, the church really struggled. Some people drove back in, but that at some point you got to ask, why does somebody drive and pass by 5 or 10 or other churches and come back down to another church? Well, family is usually the main reason, or longevity. You know, my family was a part of the church or whatever, but it's never typically about, oh, this church offers to me so much more than anything else could offer to me, that I'm willing to drive back down. So anyway, my point being that Gannon Sims is the new pastor at Cliff Temple. Gannon worked for Virginia Baptist. He was a part of a group called Fresh Expressions, which is a group that tries to reimagine how church could be in the modern world. It was imported by Virginia Baptist out of England, actually, but it's been one of the major revitalization bloodstreams that has enabled congregations to rethink who they are. And so Gannon Sims, a young guy, you know, I met him when he was in his 20s, is now the senior minister at Cliff Temple Baptist Church in Dallas, and they're doing well. They have multiple ministries. They've maintained that place. They've gone through transitions. They've gone high, they've gone low, but they have adapted to the changing environment that they find themselves in. So, real quick, options to consider for churches under 75 in attendance. Continue present ministry in your present location. That's an option. If you continue your present ministry in your present location and do exactly what you're doing now, next week and the week after and the week after that, you're probably going to be exactly the same church that you are today, except you'll be smaller. And that's just a given fact. So if you're at 35 now, average attendance in worship and a membership of 89 people or something like that, I would guess that if your only mission is to maintain exactly what you have, and you do it exactly like you're doing it, that you will continue the same trajectory that you're on, especially given COVID, and that you will find yourself continuing to be smaller and smaller in terms of numbers of people in worship, Sunday school, those measurements. Another option for churches under 75 is to arrange to share facilities with other entities. There are a lot of congregations that share their facilities. Other denominations or even other faith groups share the same space, or even nonprofits, and so the congregation becomes more of a community center on the whole than it is thinking about itself as a, kind of a singular missioned Baptist church, let's say. We do worship, we do it this way, we do it at this time, and that's what we offer, and if you like that, fine. If you don't like that, well, then we don't really have anything for you. When I was pastoring in Tampa, we had 11 o'clock service Sunday morning like everybody else, and I was talking to Lyle Schaller, who is kind of the preeminent church consultant at that point, and written dozens and dozens of books. And he goes, well, you're setting yourself up to fail, and I hope you enjoy that. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, you said this is the only time you can worship God. It's at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. He said, you're in Florida, and you got a lot of sunshine, you got a lot of transients, you got a lot of people moving around all year long because there's no dormant winter. He said, you might want to think about offering some other worship times and other worship services, which we did. But it made a point to me that, churches are really interesting communities because we have set up this sort of expectation for how things have to happen and when they have to happen. And basically the 11 o'clock worship hour is an agrarian model, right? It was so that you could get the cows milked and get to church. And Sunday night was just a continuation of the after church meal, and then the singing, as we did in East Texas at Concord Baptist, where my mother grew up, and then the singing kind of developed into a worship service later in the afternoon. And then all of a sudden, God had ordained all this, and it was really an adjustment to the cultural need, right? It was an adjustment to the fact that if you had cows, you're going to have to milk them on Sundays. They don't take a day off. So that's kind of how we got there. Third thing, relocate. I would just say that relocation will not typically turn a congregation around without fresh vision, energetic, committed leadership, a strong commitment to embrace change, and an unusual ability to take risks. In other words, if you look at a congregation that moves to a different location in hopes that it can survive or that it will gain more people, those two things do not equate. There's no number that will allow you, no examples that will allow you to see in the current age in which we live. In the 50s and the 60s, you look at Second Baptist Richmond and where it transitioned to over the years. Yeah, they plopped themselves out at the end of River Road, and they got a lot of people, a lot of money and a lot of people. But that model today is not how church is done. Everything's changed. There's no predictable built-in group of people that want to go to church anymore. 18% of the population of the United States is in church on any given Sunday morning. You'll see numbers higher than that, but when you really do an in-depth study, it's about 18%. So that's not a lot of people that feel like they want to get up and go to church on Sunday. Continue ministering in new ways. In other words, a dramatic restart of the congregation with radical changes. That probably doesn't sound too attractive to you at this point because you've become accustomed to the way you do church. Yes, I'm sorry.
Do you want us to ask questions as?
I do. I'll stop in just a minute.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I'm gonna get through this, and then I've got some questions, and then I want you to ask questions. So anyway, dramatic restart. When I pastored in the Washington D.C. area, there were at least 5 or 6 churches that literally restarted. They had gotten down to a number that they just didn't feel like was sustainable. And so they restarted. They renamed themselves, they retooled, they came back with a different way of doing things, different way of worship, et cetera, and they restarted the congregation literally. And that was kind of a thing, at least in major metropolitan areas. There are some churches here in the city that since I've been here, Patterson Avenue, I think donated their building to another congregation. And that's how they decided that they would move when they got to a certain size that was not sustainable for them. What's the church that Bonaire Baptist purchased at kind of the 3 Chopped in Patterson area, New Covenant? Yeah, and I don't know what's happening. They've sold that.
They resold it. They didn't make it. It didn't work for them.
Yeah, it didn't work. Yeah, so these are not easy things to do. The final thing, and I don't know if you've talked or if you've done any work with this, is become a legacy church. And what is a legacy church? That's when a congregation decides that it takes its rich history and background and it takes its resources that it has amassed, and you have a lot of those, and decide to invest in new ministries to further the kingdom of God and to use all of the goodwill, all of the deep investment, all of the life-changing things that have happened in their congregation, and to let that flow out into active, effective ministries that are given new life and possibility because the resources generated that possibility. There's a whole process for becoming a legacy church. When a church decides, we're going to sell our building, we're going to figure out how we want to continue on, but we're not going to try to keep up our facility. We're not going to try to keep doing church the way we do it. There's a whole process to go through for that. That's not a decision that you would make in some business meeting or something like that. You would want to seriously consider, if this is how God is leading you and what God wants you to do with your resources. So, how do I go backwards? I don't want to go backwards. I don't want you to look at those questions necessarily. Let me stop, and I've been at this now for an hour. Let me stop and see what your questions are, or what your responses are, kind of what you want to say.
I don't understand the legacy church.
Legacy church means that you take your resources and invest your resources into other ministries. So an example of that would be, I know of a church that sold their property for like $3 million, and they invested that money in a New Start church that had already shown a lot of potential and possibility, and they resourced that church so that they could be effective and strong. Other congregations that have decided to be legacy churches might invest their financial resources in community centers or in some other work that the congregation finds to be, finds to be efficacious for them. That is to say that it fits your DNA. And so, like the center that's here, there are congregations that have sold their property and invested in community centers, Baptist community centers. I have a friend that's pastor of the Wyuka Road Baptist Church in Atlanta. At one point, Bill Self, their pastor, said we're 5,000 Bibles strong, and they were probably half of that, but he liked to say it. Anyway, their neighborhood changed. They had a lot of conflict. A lot of people left. They got down to like 150 people. My friend just went as pastor. They're selling their property. for about $80 million, and they're moving into a smaller facility that more suits their smaller congregation so that they don't have all this upkeep and all this deep investment. Now, I don't know what they're doing with $80 million yet. It's not really public, so y'all keep that under your hats. But they're going to find a way. They're not going to hold on to that $80 million. They're going to find ways to invest in things that they feel are important. And that's not an easy thing to do either. You have to really be prepared if you're going to do that, to be able to have a process in place so that the church doesn't end up, kind of fighting over what they think the money ought to be used for.
So the difference in that and relocation is what's done with that investment money, right?
It is, and relocation means that you would relocate and stay a congregation in a church that's a legacy church. Typically, there's a lot of different ways to do this, but typically either finds a church home with another congregation, or they might rent space from another church and meet. If the decision is that you all want to stay together like you are, and you don't really want to change anything that's really significant, and you want to stay, tight and with this group of people, then you could do that, but you don't have to do it and try to keep up a building like this. And then you can take the money if you were to decide to sell the building. And you could move the dial in Richmond, Virginia with the kind of money that this place is worth. You could actually move the dial. And by that I mean that there are people who are struggling, there are people who are marginal, there are ministries that are struggling to do amazing things that could benefit greatly by an influx of financial help. That is a significant investment someplace. So, you all will have to think about, given the value of your property, do you want to hold on to it? Do you want to keep it for yourself? Or would you want to say that we're willing to, gift it? And I'm not saying I'm saying that I think you need to be in a process to discern God's leadership in this work, not that you just begin to say, well, I think, I think you have to sit with yourself and sit with, at least give yourself to the time it takes to let, these kinds of things move through your heart and your head. You had a question?
Yeah, I was wondering if there had been any studies on what times worships were most effective.
Oh yeah,
Has
yes.
the effectiveness gone to a Thursday night or?
Everything under the sun. Let me tell you one of the most fascinating studies. I was the transitional minister at First Baptist Washington, D.C. And they were struggling. We had about 150 or 60 people when I was there. Now they're like 80. And like you, they have a lot of money because they built a parking garage in Washington, D.C. So their money's not their problem. People in effective ministry is part of their issue. But I shared with them, I had read about a church in London, that decided they would open it from 11 at night till 3 in the morning. And they put a sign out in front of their church that said, if you would like to talk with someone, or you need a cup of coffee, you kind of get the idea, on a kind of a sandwich sign out in front. And this was busy major metropolitan area. They were overrun. They had thousands of people coming after about a year. And what they offered was somebody for people to talk to. So they said literally there'd be somebody come out of an apartment building and they'd had a domestic dispute and they were seeking refuge, because they were being harmed, or that they, were on drugs and, were wanting some help to know how to get back into their program. You just name it. And they had worship services. They had I don't know how many, 3 or 4 or 5 worship services, and they were simple 30-minute services, and they did them through these hours. I mentioned that to First Baptist Washington, and you probably know that they didn't jump on that. But yeah, certainly churches have learned, and it's kind of old now, but the Depends on the family, depends on the children, depends on kind of their schedule. When we went to an early service, I noticed that I started getting a lot of older guys, and they saw this as an opportunity to get on the golf course earlier, you know. But we started it because we wanted to relate to younger people, but I ended up with all these, you know, I finally asked them, I said, what are y'all doing here? Well, you know, it's great to be here at 8:30, and I'm finished at 9:30. I can go about my day. One of the most successful worship services in Richmond is at the St. Stephen's Episcopal Church at 5:30 on Sunday evenings. They draw people from all over the city, probably 500 before COVID. Most of that congregation they're not members of St. Stephen's. And they come for the Celtic service. It's very, I don't know if any of you have ever been, but it's very contemplative. The music is outstanding. And they have a 7-minute sermon. So there's a successful time for a worship service. But I have a friend in Louisville, Kentucky that started a service at 4:30 on Fridays for street folks, primarily. Very, very successful. So it really depends on sort of, you know, how you feel, what you feel like, you know, God's calling you to do. But I think the critical factor is the willingness to change. I think all of this conversation is really just hollow if a group of people say, we want to stay the same, but we want more people to come and be with us. It's not going to happen. And I don't think that's new news for you, but it's just not going to happen. We live in a very unchurched culture now, and people have very specific needs. You know, I walk the neighborhood. I was over at Afton Chemical, which is, you know, multi-billion-dollar company. They do research and development for oil products, and so I took the occasion to come by here afterwards and walk the neighborhood. And you know, this is a alternative neighborhood, kind of a, I don't think the word hipster fits it, but you know, Black Lives Matter signs and pride flags flying, and you know, it looks like a neighborhood that's close to VCU, and it looks a little bit like our neighborhood if you go down a couple of blocks closer to VCU. So, you know, neighborhoods are not what they were. You know, when I was growing up in the 1950s in Dallas, everybody looked the same and everybody thought the same, and we all pretty much walked lockstep, and everybody went to church. And that is certainly not what's happening. So, yeah, so there's all kinds of experimentation that takes place with churches. But I would say that the biggest turn of the dial is not, I don't want to call worship times gimmickry, but the biggest turn of the dial is not about methodological things in making these kind of changes. It's about passion, and it's about direction, and it's about a sense of calling. And it's about, I'll go back to where I started. It's about saying, okay, we're gonna sit down and we're gonna rethink what we're doing. We're comfortable, we like each other, we love each other. But we're gonna rethink what we're doing. And we're gonna rethink it because God is always leading and moving and is dynamic. Not because we want, if any church heads out to say they want to grow, and this is the mistake churches make that relocate. Why do they relocate? Because we want to reach new people, more people. People get a sense of that, and I'm saying that in 2020, 2022, that just is not a good strategy. You might plant a church in a new neighborhood, brand new, but you know, you got to kind of think like those folks and match up with those folks if you want to be successful. So there's a lot to think about when you start talking about relocation. It's not that it's, you know, I mean, it might be one of your options, but I would guess that maybe there's some other things that might be more possible than relocation of Pine Street. And that's just my own brief encounter with sort of the numbers and the demographics. Where would you go? You know, you got to ask that. Where would you go? And from what I understand, people drive in from a lot of different places here. So, other questions? Yes, Susan?
So your holy indifference was my takeaway from the book that we read 2 summers ago. What's her name?
Ruth Haley Barton.
Right.
I forget the name of the book.
Right, but that was my takeaway, and it was,
Pursuing God's will together. Yeah.
it was a process.
She was very informative to us with this. She's a friend of us.
Oh.
Yeah.
So that was my takeaway from that. It's nice to
Mm-hmm.
see the thread here, and and that's hard. It was all summer long. You had mapped out every week we'd read a chapter, and it took all summer for me to feel like I might be there. But that was 2 summers ago.
Right. Yeah.
So
Right. You got to hit refresh.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
And I kind of, I'd kind of shared with the people, in this process that trying to figure out God's will, we have to put it all on the table. You can't say we want to discern God's will, but I'm not going to give up this.
Yeah.
And you got to work with this God. That it's got to be everything. And I included myself in that. I said, even if that means you need new pastoral leadership. And, you've got to be willing to put it all out there. Because if you start holding pieces back, then I think you're not.
Well, it's like, the pig and the chicken, right? Some people it's just laying an egg. Others it's the pig has to give up his or her life, right? So, that's a bold statement for you to make because that's a big life decision, But not trying to paint this in a glorious way, but I really am one of those people who believes that sometimes things get better when you decide you're willing to relinquish. And I'm thinking of all kinds of people that are doing things that they never dreamt that they could do because they just weren't willing to relinquish, or that they just were fearful to step out. And churches that want to change that bell curve that we saw earlier, there's got to be a departure place where you peel out and you redream the dream. That's an old image, but nobody's come close to replacing that. And that is to say that the only way to break this cycle that we saw is to redream the dream, is to get back to the kinds of energy and strength that initiated this church in the beginning, or that sustained it, or that propels it. That's where you gain your strength, and that's where we all start feeling like life, like it works, like it makes sense. We're not struggling to, fit round pegs into square holes anymore, and it releases a burden. It really does release a burden. I'm as you can well imagine, 2 70-year-olds that are merging their lives together. We have a lot of stuff, and Dan and I both are very sentimental, and we have a whole basement full of stuff. And if you've never been through your stuff, and everything passes through me emotionally. Like if I'm in big trouble, if somebody else got rid of it, I'd be great. But if I look at it and hold it, I don't care what's her name, the Japanese, what I'm blanking on her name, but anyway. If I pick it up and hold it like she recommends and decide whether this helps me or hurts me, it all helps me, so that's not working for me. But I experience great relief when I'm finally able to see stuff move out, and certainly getting married and refocusing, repurposing. We both had to make enormous adjustments with all our stuff, not just that, but just our whole lives, you can well imagine. So, it's a risk. We took a risk. We decided to get married, but we love each other and we felt led to be married. So, that's the same thing with church, really. If you feel led, then things begin to surface and to emerge, and it's pretty exciting to think about that, really. It is, and if you allow yourself to do it. So.
Well, I feel like that's the way we have to approach this. It's not, oh, well, it's us, what are we going to do? It's like, we've got this opportunity.
Oh, you got
what are we going to do?
Great opportunities.
Yeah. And to look at it in a positive.
However it goes, you have great opportunities. You really do. I think I would really encourage you to think in that way.
But you were saying, a big, 15, 18% of people
Mhm.
go to church.
Right.
So, to your way of thinking, what makes those unchurched people start going to church?
It's a hard go. It's a hard go. You know, when you start talking about unchurched, 20 years ago, there was all this material about reaching the unchurched, like the Willow Creek churches that adapted, the whole worship and big screens and drama and all that, to reach, quote, unchurched people. But what Willow found out, do y'all know Willow Creek Church? And it's had all kinds of stuff going on, but it was at one point sort of everybody was Mecca, even for, a lot of Baptists and Virginia Baptists included. But what they found out when they started looking at, quote, the unchurched people is they're a lot of relapsed Catholics. So they had experience and they had motivation, because Catholic people are taught to go to church every Sunday and give their money and to go to confession. And so they made perfect, non-denominational, soldiers. They would show up and they would give their money, and they had a new system that made sense to them, but the behavior was very familiar. So it is a hard thing. I mean, there are a lot of New Start churches around, and a lot of them are in the city, and it's hard. I talked to Sterling Severns this week at Tabernacle, and Sterling's done a marvelous job of revamping Tabernacle Baptist, but every week, I mean, he has to struggle for just, enough critical mass to have church. And they've gotten some people because of a church that closed down, Northminster Baptist. They had Korean people who were evangelized by American Baptists in the 1920s, and they came to Richmond and they started working with Korean people, and they got a lot of folks through that. But they don't have a lot of neighbors in my street that are walking down to Tabernacle. Now I'll tell you what they do have is they have a community center there, or they do, they have clothing and all that, and we have neighbors who volunteer in that ministry, but they're not members. So I was standing with my youth minister 20 years ago, and we were watching a basketball game of our church team, and they were really good. And I said, where do these guys come from? He goes, they're around Tampa. And I said, do they come to church? He goes, what do you mean by that? And I said, do they come to church? He goes, what do you mean by that? Do they come on Sunday mornings at 11 o'clock? No. Do they come on Thursday nights at 5:30 after practice? So I've got 25 of them coming. So, you got to kind of rethink what are you trying to do? Because that was as much church as they were going to get, from me at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. So, and that was 20 years ago. Things have really changed and adapted a lot since then. But that's the kind of mindset, that I had to start having about what it meant to have church. And if you start talking about people that aren't going to church, you never start by assuming they're going to come in the doors, and you guys are tight. If you're legacy members, which you are, and you're sort of a legacy member, and you're a legacy member, I mean, that you don't even understand how tight you are till somebody tries to come in from the outside. It's like me trying to adapt to my wife's family, her 3 sons and all their kids. I mean, they're wonderful people, but they're tight, and I'm still sort of an outsider, and they don't understand that. They just don't have a category for it. So, and I'm not being critical, it's just the nature of human dynamics. And so once a church has been together for a while, a long time, and y'all been together a long time in this format, it's real hard for newbies to find their way in unless they're really working hard at it. And I've visited a lot of churches, preached in a lot of churches, and what is really remarkable is how little attention church people pay to new people on the whole. And I've been that new person. And I've visited churches in Virginia where, they didn't know why I was there, but nobody spoke to me. And that's not the end all and be all of church, but at least it's a starting place. But here's one of the things I really believe and strongly is that if a church knows how to love unconditionally or is working on it, and if it's willing to get rid of itself, meaning, holy indifference, but if it's really working on unconditional love, and if it's really working on grace and hospitality, then, I think that's still something that every human being needs. Now, you know, it's that whole trust factor. You know, does the neighborhood, if you know, one of the questions I'm asking for you to think about is you went to 10 households down the street here and asked them what they think about you, what they know about you, and would they ever consider venturing into this building. It'd be interesting to know what they said. When I was in Tampa, we hired Disney to do our market research for our church. And literally we had people that, you know, you could see the house and they would say, where is that church? And we had a big steeple, you know, we were sitting on a corner, we had no parking, but we had a big steeple. And they would say, where is Bay Shore Baptist? It's like, it's right there. It's been there since 1956. I didn't really pay any attention to it. But what was also interesting to me is that Willow Creek, this huge 25,000 member church in Chicago, did the same thing. And they had the same reaction from people in their immediate neighborhoods. Where's Willow Creek Church? It's like, it's that huge building right over there, you know? So, yeah, it's making those community connections. It's being willing to be patient about that. It's trying different things, and watching them fail. And, you know, I mean, try them again, try something else. If failure is if you're scared of failure, you may as well not even try, because stuff's going to fail if you try new stuff. So, and you have to think about your resources. You know, one of the filters that you've got to run yourself through if you're thinking about any of those options that I put up earlier is you got to have the faith to consider this. You've got to think about your actual human resource power. What can you actually do? You know, you all aren't as strong as you were 2 years ago or 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. What are you actually capable of doing from a human investment point of view? And, you know, the last category is, do you have the financial resources, you know, so that you're not grabbing at every person hoping that they'll give you money. You all are in that position of having financial resources, but that can be a blessing or it can be a curse. And the curse part of it, as you know, is that you could stay here till the last person turns the lights out. You know, Philip could be hand in hand with the last two people and y'all could turn the lights out and you'd still have enough money. So, and if you spend all your money on restoring this building, nothing's going to change about who's coming or how many people are coming. That's not going to change. People's coming into this building. This is we built these churches as holy sepulchers. You know, they're not Mormon temples, but some of them kind of look like it. And if you hang out with people that don't go to church, like I do more now than I ever have in my life, because the first thing they know about me is not that I was a Baptist minister. They'll just tell you, you know, all these churches look like fortresses, like First Baptist, and you just name it. We built these buildings and we didn't really think about human beings that didn't get it coming in. We just built these buildings because they were beautiful and they matched the architecture of whatever former, you know, decade or century. So real quick, I know y'all are getting tired, and one of Dana's sons is coming tonight with his wife, Mo. She's Thai, from Thailand. Her mother is with her. And it's the first time she's ever been in the United States, first time she's ever visited since they got married 5 years ago. There's a new baby, Theo. And so the grandmother is here, and they're driving down tonight to Richmond from New York, and they're coming to our house, and so we're going to have a real interesting, you know, couple of days, right? And Theo's this darling. He's my favorite. I shouldn't say that. I'd get slapped by Dana. Yeah, I'd get slapped by Dana. I mean, he's so cool. Okay, I'm going to leave these questions with you, and I don't want to discuss each one of these, but I started with a tough one. Are you stuck? In other words, are you going around and around in circles with this conversation? A few years ago, there was a duck on a pond in Lubbock, Texas, and it just kept circling. Nobody could figure out why, and somebody went out and got the duck. It was missing a foot, and so it could only go in a circle, and a lot of times that's how these conversations go. They just go in a circle because you run into tough decisions. And so, are you stuck? And if so, why do you think you're in chains or straits, so to speak? What do you think holds you there? Just a discussion question. I'm going to ask you in a minute, I'm going to pass out 3x5 cards, and I'm going to ask you what might be the elephants in the room? Do you know what that, you familiar with that phrase? Things you don't want to mention, talk about. What are the elephants in the room that you're not willing to address? I'm going to ask you to write down an elephant if something comes to mind, and you're going to turn them into me, not to Philip. I'm going to have Dana type them so that nobody can see your handwriting. And I hate to sound so secretive, but if we're going to talk about elephants in the room as an initial process question, then you might just want to do that anonymously, and I think that's perfectly fine. But what are elephants in the room that would hold the church back, or that would be too difficult to talk about? And I have to tell you, I've been very impressed with my conversations with Philip and with what I've read that you've already done, and the kind of statement that Philip just made. I know I can feel the quality of the leadership in this church from this wonderful couple that have led you so effectively. And I'm just telling you, that's a starting place that a lot of churches don't have. I worked with a congregation in Portsmouth, and we didn't have a chance from day one. In fact, I stopped working with them because the minister was holding on so tight to things that we couldn't make any progress. And I was engaged by a layperson in the church, and she was trying to climb up a wall that was unsurmountable. So what are the white elephants in the room? What must die in you or your collective congregation in order for you to move forward? We already talked about that in the sense of the holy indifference. What frightens you about the next step, and what energizes you about the next step? If you ask 10 households in your block what they know about you or what the community would lack if you were not to exist, what would they say? It's an interesting thing to know. What is your bold kingdom dream? As I said before, there's no way out of this decline for any congregation if it's not redreaming the dream in such a way that it's bold, but it's realistic. And what is your kingdom dream? Why would someone pass other churches in order to attend your church when you're talking about growth? What would so compel them that they would pass by any number of other churches, because Richmond has a lot of them? And what kind of energy do you have to devote to dreaming a new dream for Pine Street? And that, either way that question gets answered, it's okay. I've been at places in my life where I just didn't have it in the tank anymore, and I just had to admit that I couldn't do X, Y, or Z. And I think you have to assess your human resource, just like your financial resources, and say, do we have the energy to do X, Y, or Z? Because let me tell you, if you're even thinking about relocation, that is a huge process. You put your minister into a sort of a CEO position and of construction and who knows what, but it's a hard process, and all of these directions require energy, except doing the same thing. What's the craziest idea you've ever entertained about the future ministries of the church? Something to think about. What do you fear regarding Pine Street, and what makes you smile when you think about Pine Street? So let me just close with that. What makes you smile about Pine Street? Anybody want to venture in?
Your friends.
Friends, yeah. Yeah, people, yeah.
Past and present.
Yeah.
We have a wonderful history of people that we've all been close to in many ways.
Yeah. And that's still informing you.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the great realizations for me, and I'm sorry, I hope this doesn't make you uncomfortable, but in losing Ann was that my life is still being informed by that relationship and always will be. And so will our sons and our grandchildren. So.
Well, in my situation, I got divorced after I'd been married for 30 years. And I came into the choir room and I had to tell them. And so I went to tell them, and one of the ladies in the choir, Peggy Waves, when I told her, she says, oh, thank goodness, I was afraid you were gonna leave us and go to another church. And it just, you know, the whole thing.
That's
got
pretty
so
funny.
hard. I just-
That's pretty
I was
funny.
having a really hard time telling it, and I started laughing.
That's pretty
But
funny.
before I left there that night, 2 people in the choir came to me and said, my oldest son was away at college, and said, do you and David need a place to stay? You know,
Wow.
and so we've had that kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. Well, I just want to say thanks for letting me be here tonight. It's always helpful to me to meet with people like you. And Dana walked through the kitchen a couple of times while we were talking, and she goes, I like him. And
Was I on speakerphone?
yeah, you were. Yeah, she came through to do something, and so and I do too. You know, I like I said, I can feel the quality that is in this place. And, you know, if I could say anything, it would be that you shouldn't fear a process. You don't have to do it, and you can still do what you're doing, and you'll keep doing this for a while. But if you want to think about grabbing hold of something new and different, then I would say don't fear it. You know, if it's God's leadership, that's we don't have to fear that. And so I just want to reassure you about that. I will have to say that it is work to change, but nothing is happening different in any congregation in the country where people are not adapting and changing significantly, and you know, and especially because of COVID now. And that's a good thing in a lot of ways. So, you know, you have to think about, you know, I think about Dr. Somerville, you know, they got a lot more people listening in now than they had before COVID. They don't have as many people in the pew, but they got a lot more people listening in. So the message is being, you know, communicated. So, yeah. Will y'all hang for 5 minutes, 5 more minutes? Philip, you want to help? Let's pass out those pieces that you Xeroxed tonight or copied.
These are the same things that I gave you in the envelope. People responded. You know, too, I had people write up their thoughts and didn't realize we were going to use them, and so I just made new copies. I didn't have time to tell you to bring them or anything. So who wants to do something with them for tonight?
And I don't expect you to read that, you know, now, but just to have that as a reference point, you know, if y'all decide or we decide to move forward, we'll come back to that piece. And then, everybody will take a 3x5, and if you'll just take a few minutes, and this is the elephant in the room part, something that you wouldn't necessarily want to say out loud. But we all, again, it's not like we're keeping secrets, but it's just kind of helpful. So if you want to write something on that, you don't have to, but that would be helpful. While y'all are doing that, I'm going to see if I have to pick up anything from the grocery store.
Yeah.